Mr. Speaker, it's my pleasure to stand and support this bill.
Mr. Speaker.
Dr. David Clark.
Mr. Speaker, Labour will be supporting this bill and we're glad to see it passing, and we're glad that it's finally made its way through the House. I want to take up a point that was raised by Mojo Mothers in her contribution, where she said that it was logical that the onus of proof should sit with a company that's making claims to consumers. I agree with the contribution she made in that respect, and want to expand upon it a little to talk about the concept of rational ignorance, because this is one of the principles that underlies these consumer protections. Economists use the term rational ignorance to refer to the advantage that lies in being a consumer who does not have to research every single aspect of every single product that is consumed. It is far more efficient for the consumer and for the society as a whole, where common sense rules apply and a consumer can rely on what is called rational ignorance. It's ignorance that is entered into in a rational way, knowing that it's an efficient way of going about things and that is of wider good to the economy. When a product is claimed by a company to do a certain thing, I guess at the most extreme end it might be a pharmaceutical product that claims to provide a particular remedy, it should not be the responsibility of every citizen to go and necessarily test whether that product provides that remedy or not. There are extensive trials which are undertaken on most drugs that are available today, and it would indeed be almost impossible for any ordinary citizen to carry out the kind of testing that might give them full consumer knowledge of the impacts of any particular given drug. So, in one respect, even where there are substantiated claims that are researched by an individual consumer, there is only up to a certain point that the consumer can be expected to understand and learn about a product. And generally, most of us go about our day-to-day business relying upon the claims that are made for products and effectively understanding and rightly expecting that they will be true. And so it is good that this law that we are passing today strengthens those provisions and makes sure that consumers can trust that the claims that are made are in fact substantiated and correct, and that they can go about their business in a most efficient way. It's the same, of course, that happens with governments, where consumers, in this case voters, vote in a government based on the claims that they make and trusts that a government will get on with what they are supposed to do or what they've said they will do. And it's right that voters should expect that to be the case. And in fact, of course, we see when governments of different ilks don't live up to the claims they make, they of course get voted out. That's the mechanism that applies in that circumstance. But often too, in terms of policy development, governments do things that were not signalled in advance. An obvious example that springs to mind is the increase by this government of GST, which was not signalled in advance. It was something the government did once it was elected, and people tend to react badly to that because it was not a claim that was clear and transparent beforehand, and I'm sure that will have consequences in due course for the government. People will lose faith in it, and indeed, as my colleague points out, they did say something quite different. John Key said that he would not put up GST and then did. But another example would be retirement savings policy. Most ordinary citizens don't research every single aspect of retirement savings. They generally trust that the government will plan ahead for their future. They elect people to make decisions on their behalf, and they expect that they will be able to get the superannuation one day. And we know, though, those of us that have looked into the area more thoroughly, that in fact that is not possible under current settings, and that's why in the Labour Party we're looking to have a consideration of whether the retirement age should go up. We're looking to ensure that KiwiSaver becomes universal so that people actually have full retirement savings policies, and we would resume, of course, funds to the Cullen Fund to make sure that there is a fund there that can support the kinds of retirement that Kiwis expect. Otherwise, further down the track, New Zealand consumers of the actions of politicians are going to be very disappointed with what has happened over the years. And I think as politicians, we are elected to make substantiated claims, to make defensible claims, and to allow ordinary citizens to apply what economists call rational ignorance, a sense of trust in the decisions that we make, and trusting that we will make the right decisions upon their behalf. And so that more general principle that we're approving and supporting in this legislation, I think, should also be applied to the broader decisions that politicians make. And I'm arguing in that particular instance that we should have more rational policy around superannuation, because that is what the voters expect. They expect to be able to have a dignified retirement, and the current settings don't allow for that. Coming back to the principles in the bill, I guess the other thing that we're frustrated about in this bill is the amount of time it took to pass through. This legislation was initiated in 2009, that's 4 years ago, and is only now coming to its final stage. The government has seemed more intent on getting on with other things like selling off assets than it has with putting consumer protections in place, or indeed in collecting tax. We've just learnt this week that $8 billion is the amount of outstanding tax, which is twice the value of the government's asset sales program. And this government has been slow to repair the IRD's tax systems. The IRD itself is a department under pressure, and we see the effects of that as ordinary New Zealanders begin to wonder whether the government really has a fair attitude to collecting taxation. And again, with the slow passage of this legislation, consumers could be wondering whether the government really has it as a priority to look after them, to look after the ordinary man and woman in the street and their interests, or indeed whether it is far more interested in doing deals, selling off assets, building casinos off the back of problem gambling, and bailing out corporates like Chorus or Rio Tinto, asking very little in return. This government does seem to be distracted. It does seem to be increasingly arrogant as to the will of the voters that put it there. And of course we on this side of the House are picking up a different mood. New Zealanders are frustrated at the widening inequality, and while we are pleased that this bill will do some small thing in terms of putting a little plug in the dike, it is growth in inequality that will continue unabated even with bits of legislation like this in train. I guess Consumer New Zealand could claim a victory out of this legislation. They put pressure, together with the Labour Party, on making sure this legislation was expedited to minimise ongoing harm. And it did get there in the end. Albeit on a very slow path that saw it go from 2009 through its various stages to only being passed now. Substantial changes were made at Select Committee, and so the Select Committee must be congratulated for its hard work along the way. There were a number of details that were amended, clarification of the prohibition on unsubstantiated representations, prohibition of the use of unfair terms in standard form consumer contracts, requirement that contracting out of any Consumer Guarantees Act provisions be reasonable, fair and reasonable, increasing maximum penalties for breaches of the Fair Trading Act, enhanced enforcement powers for the Commerce Commission, and the removal of changes relating to the Carriage of Goods Act, to name but a few. There was also a wait-and-see approach adopted to unconscionable conduct. My colleague Clayton Cosgrove drew a link between that and some of the accusations against John Banks. I won't explore them here, but all in all, the bill seems to be a step in the right direction, albeit a very slow and belated one. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Dr. Chian Yang.